Picked up a mother load of information on this band coming in at number 37 on my fantasy playlist. Boy, I love to play these Lost 45s, bring it in from the depths of space-time and just bring it right back into Technicolor right here on this fantasy playlist, right here in this video anyway. Hey, how about that for a melodramatic beginning for a Lost 45, a song that you might not even heard of unless you're a big Mr. Mister fan, although it did barely make top 30 on Billboard's Hot 100. Mr. Mister was Something Real at number 37, up from 44 on his fantasy playlist August 29th, 1987. The album was called Go On, I believe was the name of the album. I got like about 4 pages of notes on this record, and boy, I don't even know where to start. You know something? Here's the deal. Just because, now by the time they came out with Something Real, Mr. Mister, they had 2 #1 songs under their belt. They had some major success. But they lasted only a few years, didn't have that many hits. But just because a band or an act or whatever, just because they don't have that many hits or no hits or whatever, doesn't make them any less talented. And such is the case with Mr. Mister. I don't even know where to start on this. Well, first off, they did some session work, and I'll get into that in just a minute. That would be Steve George and Richard Page, the founding members of Mr. Mister. But the drummer of the band, Pat Mastelotto, I believe is how you pronounce his name. I know I should have looked up the pronunciation online, but I just got really anxious to get started on this video, getting gun-ho on the rock and roll at number 37. We're going top 40 here with Dean Kirk. Oh, by the way, Something Real, it made an appearance on the show Miami Vice. A lot of pop records showed up on Miami Vice. I remember there was a friend of mine. He was a fellow DJ at a nightclub. He was a big Miami Vice fan, and I remember one night he was telling me they were playing the song by DeBarge called You Wear It Well, or I believe it was called You Wear It Well. So it's strange how these little snippets of memories come to the forefront at times, particularly when you're making a video. But where was I? Oh, Mastelotto. Actually, he left the band later on because he had a back problem, but he played drums. He played with XTC, joined King Crimson for a number of years. I believe it was in the 90s. And King Crimson, they were a progressive rock band from England that started in the late 60s. I believe I got a couple of their songs on my Spotify. And they were definitely, by the 90s, a veteran rock band. And by the way, Richard Page, boy, this was a thrill to find this out. Vivid memories of that song by Madonna called I'll Remember, back in the spring of 1994, written by Richard Page. How about that? Richard Page was offered, and I believe this was before Mr. Mister got started. I'm not sure of the timeline, but the bottom line is Richard Page was offered a job, position, lead singer of Toto. He turned that down, got another offer. You won't believe it. Richard Page got an offer to replace Peter Cetera, be lead singer of Chicago. Legendary, we're talking about the Chicago. Another band that got started in the late 60s, right at the end of the 60s. He turned it down. Mr. Mister. He came from a semi-spiritual background. Well, he came from a spiritual background of sorts. His dad was a choir master, Presbyterian choir master. His mother was a choir master too as well. She directed the Phoenix Boys Choir, and in that choir, Richard Page along with Steve George. Later on, Steve George and Richard Page, they were in a band called Page. They signed a deal with Epic Records. They were signed by a fellow named an artist and repertoire executive. His name was Bobby Colombi. I believe that's how you pronounce his name. They released 2 albums on Epic, one for Capitol. Page, they were a jazz fusion outfit. Did not succeed, was not very successful, did not sell that many albums. They broke up in 1981. Steve George and Richard Page, they stuck together. They were doing session work. They were writing songs, singing background vocals with the likes of Michael Jackson, Rick Springfield, REO Speedwagon, Kenny Loggins, Pointer Sisters, Donna Summer. Boy, just one opportunity after another, turning one loss into a win. Now, supposedly, they wanted to form a band of their own. It wasn't much of a creative outlet for them, or not enough of a creative outlet to write songs for other people and singing background vocals. Story has it they were touring with Andy Gibb when they decided to form a band of their own. So they auditioned people. They picked up Steve Ferris, who worked with Eddie Money. He worked with Eddie Money, and they picked up the drummer Pat Mastelotto. Now here's another interesting story, an aside right here. When Pat Mastelotto when he auditioned to be drummer, he brought along a friend of his or acquaintance who was going to audition to be the bass guitarist for Mr. Mister, but that guy did not show up. There was a bass guitar laying in the studio. Richard Page took it upon himself. He picked up the bass guitar, started playing around with some chords, and he taught himself how to, well, he became the bass guitar player. There you go, of Mr. Mister. So instead of being a 5-man band, they were a 4-man band, Mr. Mister, and they signed a deal. They got a deal. Well, here's what happened. They formed in 1981. It might have been early in 1982. They played a showcase at the SIR Studios in Los Angeles in the spring of 1982. And boy, I got that information from this classic book right here I bought way back in the 90s. Woo! Yeah, it's a treasure trove of information that you find. And I love this stuff, the information like this. And after that, they signed with RCA in June, and then they came out with their first album called I Wear the Face, or I Wear This Face. It didn't do that well. It did yield a record called Hunters of the Night. Went to number 57 on Billboard's Hot 100 in 1985. I think I barely remember that record. It's quite possible that Night Tracks might have ran that a couple of times. Night Tracks on WTBS. And then the album after that, Welcome to the Real World, exploded. Well, actually, it picked up steam after, the first Broken Wings, the first single off of that, took a while to develop, and then it blew up. It went to number 1. The quasi-spiritual, the moody Broken Wings, and then Carrie came after that. That went to number 1 too, but does anybody remember called Is It Love? Is It Love? Back in 1986, man. Yeah, we're cruising down memory lane. We got the pedal to the metal, baby. I had, my goodness. They eventually broke up, 1987, 88. But once again, I'm running ahead of myself. Go On was the third album they came out with the RCA record label. And the third album, Something Real, didn't do as well for them. It went to number 29 on Billboard's Hot 100, just barely made it in the top 30. Critics liked this album because it took aim at the materialistic attitude, the materialistic essence of, I guess of American culture. I hate to pronounce things like that, but which left a big spiritual hole that the group was addressing. And but the album did not do that well. But here's the deal, though: the song that one of the singles they released off the album, called "Healing Water," actually it was their second single off the album, Grammy nominated for Best Gospel Performance. Mr. Mister. Just looking over my notes real quick to see if I missed anything, because sometimes I'll miss something like, oh God, why didn't I bring that up during the video? So, oh, by the way, I'm glad I did reconsult my notes. It is worth noting they added another fellow to the band, but he wasn't a real member of the band per se because he couldn't play any instruments. But early on, they added a person named John Lang. He was the cousin of Richard Page. He contributed to the songwriting of the group Mr. Mister, although once again he wasn't a real member of the band per se. But got to give a shout out to him. And he later left Mr. Mister. He attended graduate school in New York. And, oh, by the way, one other thing I want to mention too. Boy, I want to cover all these bases because it's just a thrill. Steve Ferris. Yeah, boy, I tell you what. Steve Ferris, he worked with Whitesnake. Yeah, remember Whitesnake? Back in the day, man. Was it in the Still of the Night, or that big heavy metal blockbusting record they did back in the spring of '87? But he was with Whitesnake later on, of course, I'm sure. He also worked with Tori Amos, the extraordinary Tori Amos. Something never will forget. First video I saw by her, solid all these years back in the spring of 1992. Absolutely fell in love with that record. Tori Amos, she was something else. Well, he worked with her, and that's it. This video's ran too long again, but boy, it's just, well, it's a thrill to share all this information with you and a little bit of personal opinion on the side. Mr. Mister coming in at number 37 with Something Real on this fancy playlist of August 29th, 1987.